Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Christopher Zehnder. Today, we discuss A Manifesto of the New Traditionalism, written from a Catholic worker perspective. The manifesto presents an integrated, dynamic vision for the redirection of the Catholic Church. Our welcome guest is Larry Chapp. With Sean Domencic and Marc Barnes, he authored the important document. Dr. Chapp owns and manages with his wife, Carrie, Dorothy Catholic Worker Farm in Harveys Lake, Pennsylvania. He is the author of Scientific Naturalism and its Challenge to the Christian Faith. Let's begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Traditionalism. It's a word that for many is a battle cry and for many a bête noir. How, Larry, did you come to organize your manifesto around this disputed theme?
Before I answer that question, I want to make it clear that the primary author of the manifesto was Sean Domencic, and it's Domencic, not Domenici. I misspelled it originally, and then Marc Barnes and I added our own sort of editorial flourishes to it and gave our advice and counsel. But the primary mover and shaker behind this was Sean Domencic. So it's a shame that he couldn't join us today. So I just wanted to give Sean the credit that he has deserved for this. But he initiated this, and then, of course, Mark and I agreed because obviously every single Catholic should, insofar as they're Catholic, be some version of a traditionalist, because we believe we're not sola scriptura types. It's not scripture alone. We believe it's scripture plus tradition, which is the engine through which God, in a sense, gets his revelation to us. But lately, obviously traditionalism can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And lately, the word traditionalism, unfortunately, has come to be associated with a certain sort of segment, especially in the United States and maybe a little bit in France and the UK. It's come to be associated with a very, very narrow vision of what constitutes tradition. It's come to be associated more and more with a group of people who have coalesced around the traditional Latin Mass, which I like, but around the Latin Mass, it's coalesced around severe criticisms of Vatican II, the post-Vatican II papacies, coalesced around criticism of the Missal of Paul VI, the so-called Novus Ordo. And a lot of that has been extremely acrimonious and very divisive. And this is what provoked sort of Pope Francis's motu proprio Traditionis Custodes, in which he has essentially, and more, especially through the dubia, essentially suppressed the traditional Latin Mass in an attempt, I think, to go after some of the more strident elements in that traditionalist movement. I don't particularly agree with Pope Francis and Traditionis Custodes, because I think it's a largely legalistic and forensic and somewhat authoritarian answer to a problem that has been festering in the church for 57 years since the close of the council. And I think that it requires dialogue and conversation more than it requires some sort of canonical remedy, which I don't think is going to work anyway. I don't think you can legislate this movement away. So therefore, that's why even before Traditionis arose, we decided that it was time to issue, in a sense, a manifesto on what constitutes, in our vision, a true traditionalism, so that, all of us who are traditionalists in some sense don't get brushed with the same brush, that we don't get associated with the more radical traditionalists. And I think there are a lot of very conservative Catholics out there who have been a bit, for better or for worse, red-pilled by the papacy of Pope Francis and are driven more and more into the radical corner. We wrote this essentially for those conservative Catholics who are struggling right now with trying to figure out what is going on in the church. And the temptation is to very simplistically gravitate towards these more angry traditionalist wings. And we wanted to reach out to them. The manifesto is not going to appeal to progressive Catholics who really don't care that much for traditionalism and who simply want to forge ahead with all kinds of, innovative things. I already know through some experience on social media that many progressive Catholics have just dismissed it as just one more form of traditionalism that they don't agree with. So the target audience really is our fellow, in a sense, conservative Catholics who are struggling right now to make sense of the ongoing development of doctrine in the church today.
Thank you. That really focuses things for us. Mario, what next?
Well, I read a few times the manifesto, and I think it's very motivating, if you will. One of the topics that I'm curious about is the first characteristic, if you will, or the first issue that you touch in the manifesto, which is abandoning the church as a fortress, as a defensive castle, rather, and instead you are focusing on a missionary zeal. Now, looking around what is happening today, it seems that that approach for many people is at least insufficient. And the reason why is that today the forces of secularism are inside the church, at least to some extent. So that may have been more an approach for, let's say, 1960s, 1950s. And you can mention there the book in 53, I think it was, by von Balthasar about the raising the bastion and
raising the bastions, yeah.
Right. And so what do you make, how then we have to go about and understand this view that you characterize as the defensive church?
Wow, that's there's a lot packed into that question. And the first thing that I would point out is that you have to pay careful attention to the prehistory before the Second Vatican Council in order to understand what we mean by the sort of fortress church. I mean, after the Protestant Reformation and then the Scientific Revolution and then the democratic political, highly secularized, laicizing revolutions in the political revolutions in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, the church found itself sort of besieged on all sides, from the Protestants, from Enlightenment philosophers, from science, and from political movements of all kind. And she was being boxed into a corner in her view. So after the Council of Trent, the church began, and the Reformation and all these various isms that were coming at the church really did, for a time, and perhaps necessarily so, kind of went into a sort of shell and sort of a circle the wagons mentality. And a theology emerged based on Thomas Aquinas, but developing him, called Neo-Scholasticism, which was an attempt to apply the doctrines of Thomas Aquinas to our time. And Neo-Scholasticism was very oriented towards refuting errors, refuting heresy, refuting philosophical errors, refuting the errors of the age. And in many ways, it was very good at that, and it was very successful. In some ways, almost too successful, because there then developed this mentality in the church that we're besieged. We need to hang on to this neo-scholastic philosophy. We cannot engage the world because the world is against us. We just need to raise the bastions, circle the wagons, and do our thing. Unfortunately, that is not a posture that could last very long. At some point, the church is a missionary church. At some point, the church is more than a set of dogmatic propositions that have to be defended theologically and philosophically. At some point, the church is more than simply a sacramental economy that it has to preserve, protect, and defend. At some point, the church has to go out to the world. It has to be a missionary church. This is not simply a call of the Second Vatican Council. This is a mandate of Jesus Christ our Lord. Okay, and therefore the Council Fathers, relying on a renewal of theology that had already taken place before the Council, called ressourcement theology, called by its detractors the Nouvelle or the New Theology. It was a theology that didn't so much repudiate Neo-Scholasticism as it sought to go beyond it, to reach back to the Church Fathers, to reach back to a renewal of Scripture, to renew moral theology, to engage modern philosophy, to engage modern culture. Now, in some ways, of course, what came after the Council, the cultural and political tsunami that hit the church after the Council, scuttled that entire project as it was co-opted in so many ways by the progressive wing of the church. Okay, and that's what we're dealing with now. Pope Benedict Joseph Ratzinger said there are two councils, the real council and then the council of the mass media, that spun the council along with progressive Catholic theologians as a liberalizing council, as a secularizing council. And that's, in a sense, the council that we got. That's the council that got sort of ensconced in the popular imagination. And that led to all the distortions and deformations in the church that we saw. And so it's a very complicated mess because the causes of the turmoil after the council are multifocal. It's a fallacy, a post hoc ergo propter hoc logical fallacy to say these things happened after the council, therefore they were because of the council. In a lot of ways, the council was an accelerant, but it was accelerating things, the combustibles that were already there in the church. And so it's our claim, my claim especially, that these distortions would have entered into the church with or without the council, because the cultural and political tsunami that was sweeping over Western civilization was not going to be met and defeated by a Catholic Church with a little Thomas Aquinas and meatless Fridays. That simply wasn't going to happen. As you see in many other religions around the world, secularization has taken place with or without major councils of any kind to give it an impetus. So I think it's a flawed traditionalism, and that's what we're fighting here, that wants to say, okay, as you pointed out, we have all these problems in the church. As Pope Paul said, the smoke of Satan has entered the church has become secularized, the council is at fault. And therefore, if we just go back before the council, we will solve the problem. We just need to repudiate everything that happened at the council and after the council. And our vision is that this is an altogether wrong-headed way to approach this, because there were already deep problems in the church before the council, as no less alike than Joseph Ratzinger noted in 1958 in a bombshell article.
More context, Christopher.
Yeah, two things I'm eager to ask you about, but in response to what you said, I'm not sure. I think the characterization of the preconciliar church is maybe too simplistic in this case, because at the same time you had, of course, I think there's a lot, what you said is true about the fortress mentality, but there was also the period after Trent. I mean, you figure you had the whole development of the Baroque art and the Baroque styles, which yes. It was very vibrant. I mean, I don't know what it's like it, but it was vibrant. And it was active, and you had, I mean, some of the greatest missionary impulses in the church after the Council of Trent. I can think of popes like Benedict XIV. I mean, you just have guys like Leo XII, but Pius VII, early Pius IX, Leo XIII, Pius XI, who wrote, I think, the most radical social encyclical yet in terms of its real engagement. I just don't. I see that there is, and maybe in theology there was a kind of stiffening that occurred, but it's not clear to me that really characterizes the period between Trent and Vatican II. That's the first thing. So,
okay, I'll respond to that. Well, first off, that's a really good caveat, because everything you just said is true. I don't mean to mischaracterize the entirety of the church's life during this era. I'm particularly fond of some of the Baroque things that you mentioned, and you got great saints. after the Council of Trent and the Church, great intellectuals. And it's absolutely true that the great flourishing of Catholic intellectual life that you saw, say, in the mid-20th century, literary and theological and philosophical across the board, that all of these people were the product of the pre-conciliar church. So it's not as if there wasn't life in that church and there wasn't sap in the veins of that tree, because there were, and nothing that I say, I hope, doesn't imply that. You are correct. You put your finger on something. I'm a theologian, and I'm focusing on what I consider to have been, and many others like Balthasar, a moribund theology that had settled into the church that was very, very defensive. Furthermore, there was a lot of missionary activity during this period of time, but we have to be careful about that, because a lot of that missionary activity was also aided and abetted by colonization, aided and abetted by the discovery of the New World, by the expansion of European power around the world. And I'm not saying the church colluded with that, and colluded with, sometimes it did. But the fact remains is that these were very complex phenomena, the missionary activity that we saw, and carried with it a mixed legacy, a legacy both of evangelization but also of oppression, and we simply have to frankly admit that. For someone like Bartolomé de las Casas, who can be praised for being one of the first people to champion, human rights for the natives here in the Western Hemisphere, was also complicit in some nasty things. So we have to be there, I think, very careful to say, hey, look at all the vibrancy that was there in the missionary activity. And I'll say that. Furthermore, I think the missionary activity, insofar it was true missionary activity and evangelical, would have been even better had it not been tied necessarily to a Tridentine form of liturgy, a Tridentine form of scholastic theology and philosophy. I think that it might have even flourished even more had it not been, in a sense, shackled by some of those things. And I do see it as a shackle. And there were missionaries around the world who saw that as a kind of shackle. So it's a mixed thing. But my focus is primarily on theology and the neo-scholastic theology. And it has to be acknowledged, for example, that the Second Vatican Council, for better or for worse, was, even though it billed itself as a pastoral council, was really a council of theologians. And the sort of reform that it sought to ensconce in the church was a kind of reform of the kind of theology that was out there at the time. In that sense, the council is limited and time-bound and historically conditioned as a council that sought to overcome the defensive fortress mentality of neo-scholastic thinking. And in some ways, they threw the baby out with the bathwater, and we could talk about that. But anyway, that's my answer to your first question. I assume you have others.
Yeah, I guess one more point on that. Neo-Scholasticism, I would think, though, that much of the theology of it depends what you mean by neo-scholasticism. Do you mean neo-Thomism? Do you mean Scotism? Do you mean there's another thing, number of things that go by the term scholasticism, but neo-scholasticism, I don't know if, in terms of Thomism, what motivated much of the missionary activity of the 17th and 18th centuries, because it really wasn't. There was a revival of Thomism abroad, but that's a small point. My question would be this: you talked about how all Catholics need to be traditionalists because we hold to tradition, but I think it's precisely the question that people are having now, or one of the problems is a lack of clarity as to what is meant by tradition. When I read the traditionalists, it seems what they mean by tradition is everything that has been handed down. So this liturgy, the liturgy that was codified at Trent, which has its roots obviously much in the previous ages, that liturgy is the tradition, as they call it, and therefore to alter that liturgy is to alter the tradition, and therefore it's to move away from being Catholic. One writer actually even says that the Novus Ordo itself is dangerous to Catholicism because of this very thing. So what do you mean when you say that we must hold to the tradition? What is the tradition?
Well, everything that you just said is tradition, and the liturgy, I think, in particular, The liturgy in particular is part of the tradition, lex orandi, lex credende. And I think that's an extremely important point, which is why if you go to, there's a section towards the end of the manifesto where we deal with the liturgical reform. And right up front, we express our deep sympathy with those who love the traditional Latin Mass, and we express our deep sympathy with its continuing relevance in the Church. We also acknowledge that the liturgical reform that the Council actually asked for does not appear to be what we got. As we said, I think we sort of said in the manifesto, we got a liturgical reform, but then it was sort of scuttled, and now we need to reform the reform. I'm not a huge fan of the Novus Ordo. I myself attend an Anglican ordinariate parish, even though I'm a cradle Catholic, because I prefer its liturgy. In many ways, I think the ordinariate liturgy for English-speaking Catholics is the liturgy the Council Fathers had in mind. It's essentially the old liturgy, but in the vernacular with, and prayers spoken out loud. So I think that the greatest point that the sort of radical traditionalists have, even though I think they overstate it, and they exaggerate it, the best point they have is precisely this issue of the distortion of the liturgy. In other words, in a lot of ways, I would claim this. Had the Church never promulgated the Novus Ordo, had it merely sort of tweaked the old Latin Mass, maybe made it in the vernacular, prayers said out loud, whatever, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. I don't think the radical traditionalist movement would have arisen in the manner that it has. And I think precisely because of the point that you make, which is that it represented, the liturgical reform represented the greatest distortion of the tradition that we saw after the council. Now, my point, though, is that the council did not mandate the liturgy that we got. And that is how we got the liturgy that we got is a story in and of itself. So my point is that I can easily sympathize with the traditionalists who say we need to preserve that liturgy. And Pope Benedict agreed, which is why he issued Summorum Pontificum and said it was never abrogated. What was sacred in the past cannot be considered, horrible now. And so, yeah, that's definitely part of the tradition. Now you say, well, what is the tradition? Obviously, you're educated in theology, as are we all here. And there are various levels of authority in the tradition that theologians have worked out. We call theological notes, levels of magisterial authority, levels of tradition. That's all got to be adjudicated. And in a lot of ways, we're fighting about that. But we don't fight, in a sense, about the level of importance to be accorded to the liturgy, because it's clearly one of the preeminent aspects of the tradition. And here I agree with folks like Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, who's written a lot on this. I don't agree with his scorched earth rejection of the Novus Ordo as this horrible, he says it's bad for your soul, it's bad for your spirit, it destroys your faith. Too many counterexamples of the Novus Ordo sustaining people's faith to take that seriously. But Dr. Peter K. is absolutely on target in his criticisms of the liturgical reform. In a lot of ways, he is.
May I interject something that you said? You said, correct me if I heard it wrong. You said we wouldn't have this conversation if the Novus Ordo was not put in place. My reaction to that, I'm not sure. And the reason why I'm saying I'm not sure is because the confrontation, if you will, between theologian and philosopher who want to go back to the old Christendom and those who were challenging these new times in order to find a new ways of proposing the church and Christ to the new era was taking place in the 1930s. I just remember the huge debate that took place in Spain with the Maritain proposal of the new Christendom, and he was about to be even condemned. There was a letter to Rome, and Garrigou-Lagrange stopped, even though he disagreed with Maritain. So the whole struggle about what is history what is religious freedom, what is a human person. Everything else was already raging in the 1940s. So the two forces that you have today, much less intellectually educated, were already taking place in the 40s. On the top of that, there was already also a liturgical movement. And Guardini was one of the
Bouillet, Guardini.
leaders. So my point is that it's not just the liturgy. I think there is a deeper reason why we are in this situation today.
First off, I love talking to you guys because you're hitting all the right neuralgic points. I mean, a manifesto by definition has to be very sort of, it's got to be short and speak in broad generalities. And you guys are really zeroing in on the sort of issues that are lurking behind all of this that have to be discussed. So I love this. First off, it's one of my central points in all of my blogging and everything, that there were huge issues going on in the pre-conciliar church already, which is why I think we would have had some massive distortions in the church after, in the 60s and 70s, even if there had been no council. Specifically, debates, as you said, on anthropology, the relationship between nature and grace, that whole debate between de Lubac, Lagrange, the Neo-Scholastics on, is God our single final natural end, or is it a secondary sort of end? Those seems like esoteric debates to most people, but they're not. They absolutely go to the core of what the issues were. And then, of course, there was Dignitatis Humanae at the Second Vatican Council, which embraced the notion of religious freedom while not challenging per se the idea of confessional states, of Christendom, as you called it. Now, my point, though, is this about the liturgy, and perhaps I overstated my case, so this is another good caveat. My point is, and we can conjecture, and who knows what really would have happened. But my attitude is, had the traditional Latin Mass sort of basically been kept intact with some modifications and tweakings to it, I think that the nature of the debate would have been less acrimonious. I think it would have remained more on the level of theologians and academic debate and academic dispute, with all kinds of disputations going back and forth, even on the contentious issue of religious freedom, which what Archbishop Lefebvre was really most upset about, although he did vote for Dignitatis Humanae at the council, only later then to repudiate it. All that said, though, my point is that we're talking in a sense about the modern radical traditionalists. And obviously there would have been strong debates ongoing in the church that began in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and would have continued on, even had there been no council in the church. But I think they have been exponentially increased in their intensity because of the distortions introduced into the church by the liturgical reforms, and the liturgical reform that then created a kind of entirely new church atmosphere, an entirely new church culture, that then really created even stronger binaries. Notice how, for example, most Catholics in the post-conciliar church did not sit around debating over coffee in their parish donut hour after Mass, religious freedom or nature and grace. They sat around debating whether or not you liked guitar masses or Latin masses and those kinds of things. We cannot overestimate the impact I think that those liturgical changes had, and we might still be having a very acrimonious debate right now and all these polarizations, even without the liturgical changes. But I really do believe that those changes were critical.
Let me ask how you would locate in the time before Vatican II, how you would locate John Henry Newman.
Okay. I think he was very influential with the ressourcement thinkers in particular. I think two aspects of his writings I think were most important. The first one being his classic book on an essay on the development of doctrine. And that essay, though I think it has flaws, as has been pointed out by some, was the kind of Grundschrift that a lot of 20th century Catholic thinkers were using as they wrote too about the nature of the development of doctrine. So Newman lurks definitely in the background there with regard to any discussion of that. But also Newman's writings on the moral conscience. A lot of people see in the Second Vatican Council and its sort of doubling down on the importance of the role of moral conscience in our lives, the clear fingerprint of Cardinal Newman. And obviously Newman is just being very Thomistic in a lot of ways. Aquinas said the same thing. You have to follow the last best moral judgment of your conscience, even if it's erroneous. Because you don't know it's erroneous, you think it's right. But Newman really doubled down on that, and I think those were the two things that where Newman was most influential. Although you don't see him explicitly quoted a lot in ressourcement thinkers, but I think his influence was definitely there.
Now, in terms of philosophy, theology, the interplay of the two, and still Newman, what about the grammar of assent? Is that something that shows us how to go beyond scholasticism, or shows us something that develops a different dimension of the Catholic intellectual life without in any way rejecting scholasticism?
The grammar of assent definitely does not reject scholasticism or Aquinas, Neo-Scholasticism. Before I go on, I want to go back to something Christopher said about the various kinds of Neo-Scholasticism were there, because it's pertinent to this question as well. Tracy Rowland, the Australian theologian Tracy Rowland, in her great book, Catholic Theology, there's a section in the middle part there where she identifies no fewer than 17 different schools of Thomism that arose in the 19th and 20th centuries. So Christopher's question there about what really constitutes Neo-Scholasticism is a good one. And in a lot of ways, I'm thinking of the manualist tradition that was really the source of most formation in Catholic seminaries. Anyway, Newman definitely goes beyond that. He doesn't repudiate it, but he goes beyond it. And what he does, I think, in a grammar of assent is something that Hans-Urs von Balthasar noted in a famous essay called The Fathers, the Scholastics, and Ourselves. He goes through each one of those eras, and he points out the strengths and weaknesses of both patristic theology and then scholastic theology. And then, of course, even modern thinking. And one of the things that Balthasar points out, that modern thought does advance in ways that go beyond even Thomistic psychology and epistemology, is the importance of human subjectivity and exactly how complex human subjectivity is, and how complex, therefore, the development of a moral conscience is, and all of the socio-cultural factors that go into the formation of our personhood, the formation of our subjectivity, and therefore the formation of our moral consciences. I think Newman, though an implacable enemy of modern political liberalism and religious indifferentism, and he saw that as the gravest threat to the church in the modern world. This shows the sophistication of his thought. Nevertheless, in the grammar of assent, he builds off some of the insights of modern thinking to develop his notion of how do we really come to assent to the faith? How do we really come to be people of faith? We have notional assent, and then we have sort of real assent. And there's a lot of other distinctions in there as well. It's actually my favorite thing that he ever wrote, the grammar of assent, and it was extremely seminal in my own intellectual formation. And I think that, too, was very important to ressourcement thinkers who were trying to develop a more evangelical understanding of the faith, rather than a strictly sort of propositional, dogmatic, deductive concept of the faith as, assenting to a set of doctrines. Important as that is, that there has to be something deeper than that, something more charismatic, existential, all that in the act of faith. And I think Newman delimbs this for us.
Well, let me call attention to three more figures and ask you how you see them in terms of your own vision. Dorothy Day, Peter Morin, and Jacques Maritain.
Well, obviously, since I run a Catholic worker farm, And I wrote this manifesto in conjunction with Sean Domencic, who runs a Catholic worker house in Pennsylvania here. The vision of Dorothy Day and Peter Morin were absolutely critical in my later intellectual development. I wasn't really that cognizant of them in my early years of graduate studies and my early years as a theological scholar. I was so very focused on Balthasar and the ressourcement school of thought, which is my limitation. It's my strength. It's also my limitation. It's my wheelhouse, but I don't know much outside of that wheelhouse. But then I got introduced to Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, and it really was like an explosion in my head, because here were two lay people in the preconciliar church who carved out a space for a form of radical Christian existence that put an emphasis both on fidelity to the church, but also a kind of radical counter witness to the power structures of the world. That greatly appeals to me. One Protestant theologian that I really like is Stanley Hauerwas. And my approach to culture and politics is very Hauerwasian, if you want to put it that way. And I see resonances of that Hauerwasian mindset already in the personalists of that era, people like Emmanuel Monnier and others, as well as Day and Morin. And that personalism and their sort of emphasis on the universal call to holiness and the radical living of the Sermon on the Mount really spoke to my heart. We could talk more about the Sermon on the Mount, but then you mentioned Jacques Maritain. Probably the book in my undergraduate years that was most influential in my intellectual formation was Maritain's book, The Degrees of Knowledge, which is about yay thick, and you need a lifetime to digest it. But in many ways, I think it's to me, it's more important than his writings on church and state, on humanism and rights and so on, even though he's brilliant in all those things. I find the epistemology, the mystical epistemology that he lays out in Degrees of Knowledge, to be absolutely breathtaking. And by the way, to go to Christopher's point, I mean, it's done within a certain kind of neo-scholastic thinking, within a certain kind of Thomistic epistemology. But he essentially says, you know what? Reason will cease to be reason, at least unless it completes itself in the mystical, in the mystagogic. And that's vintage Maritain. And I love it. I love it. So Maritain was very influential in my belief that you should not separate Catholic intellectual life from sanctity and the pursuit of sanctity, which was Dorothy Day's vision as well.
I agree with everything you said. That's wonderful. But Mario always has a further development to bring us ahead. Mario, what's up next?
I'm going back to what you said before. I'm curious about your thinking about, you said something about modernity, talking about Descartes. And in many ways, Descartes began focusing on the subject, and I agree with that. So we need not to put aside Descartes altogether, as many people did, because there you have a notion of freedom that we may have lost today in the Catholic tradition. We have some reaction against freedom. Now, freedom is a second act, so that presupposes being. So there is something before that. Now, the question today is that we are somehow either having the notion of freedom as libertarian freedom, I want to do whatever I want, or we want the state, so to speak, to control our freedom or to decide what we ought to be doing. And we have all this struggle today in the pandemic. So we're asking to control if we are going to get the shot or not, and so on. It seems that we are not aware what freedom really means. And the reason why is that because we don't have an awareness, particularly in the Catholic tradition, of the Cartesian view, the subjectivity. without all the other things that we can reject. What do you think? I think Maritain, at least the second Maritain, was aware of that, and that's why he was criticized harshly by many others. What do you think about this? What do we have to do in order to be aware of what really freedom means?
Well, before I answer that, you anticipated a question I was going to ask to you, because I remember reading Maritain, who was very critical of Descartes. In fact, as an early, budding theologian, I based my opinion of Descartes on reading Maritain's scathing denunciation of Cartesian philosophy.
Right.
So maybe you could, before I answer your question, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on where you think Maritain gets Descartes wrong.
Well, there are many aspects. The mechanism of nature, focusing on thought before being, and so on. But going back to what I said before, right? There is one intuition which is being told by Del Noce about Maritain and about Descartes, and I think he's key in understanding what is happening. And Del Noce said that Maritain made him aware that we could be Catholic and not fascist. And that was after he read Integral Humanism. And after that, he went and analyzed the philosophical meditation on Descartes, where Descartes has a notion of freedom, which we were missing in the Catholic tradition. And so when you start examining all that, you will see that today, I think the idea of freedom is key. Well, you can go back and say, well, no, it's metaphysics, yes. But I don't know if I'm very convoluted on what I'm thinking.
No, you're making perfect sense. The problem is I'm a little hamstrung in answering your question, because quite frankly, I'm not a Descartes scholar. I mean, I've read Descartes both as an undergraduate and in graduate school discourse on a system that has much exercised my imagination or occupied my thoughts. So I would be speaking as a pure dilettante, off the cuff, to say anything about whether Descartes was a Cartesian. But to answer your other what later came to be known as Cartesianism. But to answer your deeper point about how to recover a proper Christian understanding of freedom, recover it from the technocratic abyss into which it has currently fallen. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned Del Noce, because I think he's just absolutely a brilliant and overlooked thinker. I just had an article in Communio where I really quoted him a lot. But anyway, I think what has to happen is we have to pay closer attention to some Christian Catholic philosophy that is already out there and is available to us to help us intellectually, at least, recover within the church and within the church's intellectual life and her pastoral awareness, a proper understanding of freedom. The problem is a lot of it is in German. For example, I'm very fond of the philosopher Ferdinand Ulrich, German, and very little of his has been translated. I think David Schindler has recently translated Homo Abyssus, which he wrote, and others, Gustav Sieverth and others that influenced Balthasar. These are all in their own way Thomistic thinkers, but in the ressourcement school of thought. And I want to emphasize that too. Ressourcement is a form of Thomism in its own way, I think. But anyway, that's a different question. What they want to emphasize is that freedom is relational and is inherently relational, and that we have to pay attention to how human personhood, what you call, the being, the metaphysical essence, if you will, of our personhood, our spiritual substrate, how it is not a monad, how it is not an isolated, atomistic, localized thing, but is constitutively and inherently related to fulfillment in other people and in relationship. And only a freedom that is properly grounded in this more interrelational notion of the person, which, by the way, can be grounded then in modern Trinitarian theologies that want to emphasize the perichoresis in the Trinity and the relationality of the Trinitarian persons, that it's essentially relationality all the way down. And so much so, in fact, that a lot of modern thinkers, say David L. Schindler, for example, and others, would ask the question of whether or not relationality should be actually one of the transcendental properties of being, along with the one, the true, the good. Maybe we need to add relationality as well, because God is a series of relations in the Trinitarian life. And so in order to properly understand human freedom, we need to understand the divine freedom. And people like Balthasar, Sieverth, Ulrich, and others are doing that. Now, how does that translate into pastoral activity? I have no idea, because we're up against it here. We're swimming against a cultural message that says exactly the opposite to all of that. And so there's no magic bullet. There's no pastoral strategy or remedy that's going to change the fact that we are going to encounter resistance to this. And we're going to shrink as a church, as Ratzinger noted already in 1968 in the book Faith in the Future. We're going to shrink. It's just common sociological sort of insight here, that when the entire culture is lined up against you, not the entire culture, but you get what I mean, you're as a religion, you're going to have a tough swim. And all I can do as a theologian is point towards intellectual currents in the church that I think are promising in that regard. And I mentioned a few. By the way, we could recover Maritain too. That would be a big step forward. And Gilson.
Christopher, your turn. There's so many things going on here. I don't know. We need more referees and umpires.
Yeah, I'm just the point on freedom. I'm always a little allergic to the discussions on it, because I often find it's not very well defined. Yeah, and I like things defined. There's a big difference in freedom between I may and I can, right? And
oh yeah,
so the whole question. I mean, then practically, I'm a village councilman, so I'm part of the government of 400 people.
Oh man, down with the man.
Yeah. But when you're talking about practical, when you make ordinances and things, you do curtail freedom, and so on a practical level, the question often seems fairly easily resolved. But that's another point we can talk about. Have a whole other show talking about freedom. I'm going to ask you what you mean by the bourgeoisie.
Yes.
The communists and the socialists, the anarchists will talk about the bourgeoisie with a smack of the lips and a look of distaste on their face, right? Yeah. The bourgeoisie, the basic meaning is the middle class, right? The middle class of society, and that in of itself, there can't be anything wrong with that. We need the middle class of society. What do you when you manifesto, you talk about bourgeois and bourgeoisie? What are you referring to?
Well, first off, I've written several blog posts on what I mean by using the word bourgeois, and it doesn't simply mean middle class, as it's not so much an economic description of a certain economic status as it is a description of a cultural way of life, as defined by folks like Berdyaev, Monnier, and others. Tracy Rowland in her book, her most recent book, talks about it. It's a mindset that places material well-being and the acquisition of material comfort as essentially the central focus of your civilization. That it's the primary purpose of government, it's the primary purpose of our economy, it's the primary purpose of our educational establishments. I mean, I'm an educator, you guys are educators. I mean, to give people the knowledge they need to get a job, and that's important. People got to work. They have to work. They have to get a job. But in a bourgeois mind, everything gets reduced down to that. And thus, spiritual questions get squeezed out into the peripheries. As Del Noce notes, spiritual questions simply become then these utterly privatized, almost sentimentalized realities that have no public purchase. And this is the point. In a bourgeois culture, the notion that God matters to our social construction on an official level is rejected. In a bourgeois culture, the idea is that we can get along just fine, thank you very much, without, in any way, shape, or form, dealing with revelation or God or questions of the spiritual as having public purchase, as having public warrant. These are non-public realities. David C. Schindler makes this point in his book, recent book, The Politics of the Real. What political liberalism does in creating this bourgeois mentality that penultimate values, not ultimate values, but penultimate values are the centering agent of our culture, squeezes out theological and spiritual questions, subjectivizes them, privatizes them, and puts them on the level of taste, on the level of whether, I choose a Catholic Big Mac, you choose the Hindu Whopper, who cares? It doesn't matter in the long run. What's our GDP this year? What's the unemployment rate this year? That's the mentality of a bourgeois culture. I'm not the first one to notice. Yeah. Now, the problem with the term, of course, is that it's loaded. It was used by Marxists and anarchists to be very pejorative, actually, towards the economic middle class. But that's not what I mean by it. And others have used it as well in non-Marxist tonalities. Anyway.
How about economism? Economism. That's something that John Paul talked about.
Yeah, I think that's true. I go back all the way to the British economist Tawney, Tawney, wrote that great book, the Acquisitive Society, and he's making very, very similar points. All right, that in some ways the economy works best when the economy is not the central focus of everything, when other humanistic values are allowed to intrude into that and to guide it. And in some ways, it does. Obviously, we don't have a pure capitalist economy. We have Medicare and welfare and all these kinds of things, and a progressive tax code. So you don't want to exaggerate here. But Tawney was and people like E.F. Schumacher and Small is Beautiful, another British economist, making very, very similar points. Yeah, so it's economism, which is sort of at the heart of what I would call the bourgeois project.
Do you think, the kind of society that we call bourgeois is also a very dreary society. It suppresses the human desires. And I wonder, I've thought about this, is that in the 1960s, and Jim being our relic from that period can tell us more about this.
There were no Hindu Whopper burgers.
I don't even know what a Hindu Whopper is.
Would a Hindu even eat a Whopper? A Hindu would eat a veggie Whopper. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, but I wonder that that's the way the society I grew up in. I was born in '64 and grew up most in the '70s. I was inspired by the desire to escape it constantly, continually. What happened, I wonder if what the church failed to do is actually live up to what the Vatican Council actually said to do and actually challenge that bourgeois society. Instead, the church herself became bourgeois. At least
oh man, I think you just won the interwebs today. I think that's the quote of the day, because I think it's so absolutely true. And it pertains to our question of traditionalism here and what we're sort of driving at in the manifesto. One of the things that I think drives the sort of radical traditionalists to become ever more radical and to, in some ways, become more enclosed and sectarian is precisely the boredom of the church. As you said, it's dreary. Young people are leaving the Catholic Church in the United States in droves. I mean, it's just a massive hemorrhaging of young people right now. And as an educator, talked to young people, it's not some great, huge intellectual debate. It's you can tell underneath all of their various statements, they're just bored by it. It doesn't inspire them. It doesn't reach out and grab them existentially. It seems utterly banal to them. And yeah, so I think the church in the post-conciliar era, the problem that I have with the radical traditionalists is that they're not nearly traditional enough. And the fact is that as we approach the Second Vatican Council, instead of viewing it as a modernizing council, I approach it as a radicalizing council that wants to go back to the radix, the root of things, and to unleash a kind of revolution of the heart, as Dorothy Day calls it, to challenge precisely the bourgeois structures of what Bishop Barron calls beige Catholicism, to challenge that. And in many ways, even more than the sort of fortress mentality that you and I can debate a lot, I guess, the thing that I think, and Ratzinger points this out in 1958 in his famous article, The New Paganism in the Church, he points out precisely this point. There was a banality, a mediocrity, a boredom, a staleness that had crept into the church even before the council. And in a lot of ways, it just sort of grew after the council for a lot of reasons that we could talk about, but that'd be a whole nother show. It is dreary. It's very dreary.
Well,
And it can be, I mean, just passing. I mean, what the traditionalists don't see, it can be actually lived in a Novus Ordo context. Our parish here in Ohio is a Dominican parish, and it actually is drawing young people in. And it is very vibrant. It's very traditional.
Yeah.
It's a Novus Ordo mass in English mostly, and it drinks from that tradition. And so it can actually happen.
That's one of my criticisms, even though I like him, of Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, is, I mean, his scorched earth approach to the Novus Ordo makes it seem as if it just kills everything wherever it goes. It's not true. I, for example, I'm not a huge fan of folk masses and, guitar masses and tambourines and all that. But when I was a freshman in college, I was at the University of Nebraska. I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. I was at the University of Nebraska, and I went to the Newman Center there. And that Newman Center there was run by a very dynamic priest. It later came out that he was a sex abuser, but nobody knew that at the time. And he was very dynamic and very orthodox and all that. And the Newman Center there was thriving. Lincoln produced all of these vocations to the priesthood and women that went off to the sisterhood, and as well as tons and tons of just faithful kids that got married. And it was a Novus Ordo liturgy, complete with guitars and St. Louis Jesuit music and so forth. So my point would be sort of your point. It is possible to exaggerate to some extent whether or not, the Novus Ordo kills the soul, because I don't think that it does. The faith life of the community animates that liturgy, and in so doing elevates it and lifts it. And I mean, Christ is there. I mean, it's simply wrong to say that the Novus Ordo does not make Christ present, because it does. I think it needs to be reformed a bit. But yeah, your point is well taken. What is missing? Along with good liturgy in many cases, which is missing, what is really missing is the dynamic, intentional community life that people do experience in these more vibrant parishes, like I experienced the Newman Center. I mentioned I go to an Anglican ordinariate parish. We initially went to it because we were, interested in the liturgy, but that wouldn't have kept us here. It's an hour drive from our home. What kept us going to is the community, the faith life of the people that were there, which became far more. If Pope Francis tomorrow banned the ordinariate liturgy and we had to do Novus Ordo liturgies at the ordinariate parish, I would still go here because of the community that's there.
I wonder if it's time for Mario to compare and contrast with Communio e Liberazione and the dynamism therein.
Well, we need another hour. But I have I don't know if a reflection or a question that I have to myself. When I read the manifesto, you mentioned the bourgeois individualism. That rhetoric is very close. I'm not saying it's the same. It's very close to what I heard many years back about the teología del pueblo, theology of the people. So much so that the people is that magic word which somehow contain the essence of the awareness of what the direction of the church should follow. However, this view, which comes from the 19th century, is more romantic, is anti-enlightenment. And I think in some ways, bourgeois, the term used by Marx and all that, is also 19th century, is again somehow the Enlightenment. But at the same time, the pueblo is being defined as the sense of prophecy. And those who belong to that people are not the bourgeois. In other words, there is a sense of social class, which are the poor, by the way, who are the one who are carrying out the message of Jesus. Therefore, become very ideological, very inside history. The liberation is happening in history. And so, I don't know, and I have some hesitation using for that reason this term. And I don't think that is what at least I understand about the church. I always remind people what Maritain said: we have made an idol of history, particularly theologian. And so we don't see any eternal in these people. And so I don't know if you want to comment on that. I'm far off about what you said.
No, I think that what you say sort of is an interesting adjunct to the conversation of what we mean when we say bourgeois individualism, and don't read into that phrase more than what is there, other than the fact that we're criticizing the tendency of modern culture to treat human personhood as monadic and atomistic, as cut off from relational discourse with others, that the goal of human life is essentially self-fulfillment in a sort of therapeutic, individualistic sense, that I have to care for myself first before I care for others, and that kind of thing. It's not really defined with a great deal of specificity. But that's the general gist of what we're going after, the sort of technocratic, atomistic, monadic view of the localized human person, alienated, another Marxist term, alienated and cut off from the others, and a whole society constituted on the premise of that kind of autonomous, atomistic freedom. Now, that being said, I find what you say about the theology of the pueblo, the people, very, very interesting. I lived for a time in the early 1980s in the Dominican Republic, Mexico, and spent some time in Peru. And so I encountered some of this as well. I was never in Argentina, where the Pope is from. And I know, Mauro, you sent me an email where you asked me to consider an interpretation of Pope Francis that embeds him a little more closely, I guess, in this theology of the pueblo. For example, I know we're off on a tangent here. I don't think that Pope Francis is a Peronist. However you want to define Peronism. I think he learned from Juan Perón's playbook, and I think he learned it by heart. But I don't know if he is really on that kind of level of populism and so on. And so what would you, in an Argentinian context, how would you connect the theology of the Puebla and that sort of Peronist sort of charge that is often leveled against Francis? How would you situate Francis in all of this? I know it's a tangent, but it's interesting to me.
It's a very long.
Oh, you get emails from Mario too, eh, Larry?
Oh yeah, it was great. I love it. I love his emails.
There are more to come.
It's a long history, but who represent the people? Who is the one who give the feeling, the thinking, in the will to the people? The one whom the people choose. Who is that? The leader. Who is that leader? Juan Perón. So the people is Peronista. The Argentinian are Peronista.
Yeah.
How then that shape? Well, in many aspects. So where this idea comes from? Basically, it's a romantic idea. The people knows. And that you can trace back 19th century. Now, being fair here, that is very common to many nationalism that were coming from the 19th century all across Latin America, which are understood as populism. So what is the idea which are the opposite to that? Well, the quote-unquote liberal idea, or the classical liberalism, which instead of focusing on the people, focusing on the individual, the citizen, Who are the responsible of that? The Enlightenment thinkers, the Lockean, Montesquieu, all this. So the struggle there was between the elite, the Enlightenment, and what you call them populists or the caudillos and so on. And so if that is the case, then the people are the poor, the peasant, the marginalized, and they are the ones who are not contaminated with this idea that you are describing as the idea that the bourgeois reject. So that's my point. And so in some aspect, not all, of the Catholic tradition absorb this view of history, not all. And so there's a long debate about that. That is just my, I don't know, the very summarized and simplistic.
That was great.
Explaining it.
No, that was great. I love that. I think you're onto something, and I think you're onto something very important there. To me, that's why I'm always trying to figure out Pope Francis. Always, because to me, he's a very confusing and complex figure. So what you're saying has certain resonances. I'm hearing certain things that Pope Francis has said, certain things he's done, decisions that he has made that seem somewhat reflective of that, and that's why I find it interesting. But anyway, should we continue on? We've gone over an hour. I could sit here for 3 hours.
We haven't gone 3 hours.
No, I said I could go for 3 hours.
Oh, well, we could too, but if we're over an hour, we should end. And we always end with the gospel for the day. And it's from Mark. On leaving the synagogue, Jesus entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Simon's mother-in-law lay sick with a fever. They immediately told him about her. He approached, grasped her hand, and helped her up. Then the fever left her, and she waited on them. When it was evening, after sunset, they brought to him all who were ill or possessed by demons. The whole town was gathered at the door. He cured many who were sick with various diseases, and he drove out many demons, not permitting them to speak because they knew him. Rising very early before dawn, he left and went off to a deserted place where he prayed. Simon and those who were with him pursued him, and on finding him said, "Everyone is looking for you." He told them, "Let us go on to the nearby villages, that I may preach there also. For this purpose have I come." So he went into their synagogues, preaching and driving out demons throughout the whole of Galilee. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Come.
Thanks so
Thank you
very
very
much.
Thank you. This is a great conversation. I love talking to you guys.
You know we're going to be knocking on your door again, and we thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you guys. I love doing your broadcast.
Okay. Godspeed to all.
But